Before we begin, just a quick note to viewers who value this kind of deep, source-driven history. Go ahead and subscribe to The Survival Record. This channel exists for people who really care about what war actually did to societies, not just how battles were won. Most people assume civilian survival in World War II came down to ration cards and government charity. That's the simplified version. The harder truth is that rationing systems alone were never enough. In every country under prolonged strain, bombing, blockade, occupation, or total mobilization, millions of civilians stayed fed because they quietly reinvented food systems from the ground up. These were not acts of desperation so much as adaptive intelligence. They were practical, often ingenious responses to structural collapse, and honestly, many of them shaped post-war thinking about resilience, logistics, and civil defense. What's striking is how rarely these systems are discussed, even though they kept entire populations functional for years. What follows are 6 civilian survival practices from World War II that worked not because they were heroic, but because they were disciplined, collective, and, honestly, brutally realistic. One of the most effective food systems of the war was, surprisingly, built in backyards, schoolyards, and even bomb craters. Britain's Dig for Victory campaign is often remembered as cheerful propaganda, but its real significance lies in how completely it rewired civilian expectations. By 1943, roughly half of Britain's fresh produce was coming from small-scale domestic plots rather than commercial farms. Lawns, tennis courts, public parks, and even sections of Hyde Park were converted into food-producing ground. This worked because it wasn't symbolic gardening. The Ministry of Agriculture issued detailed guidance on calorie yield per square metre, crop rotation under low fertilizer conditions, and seasonal planning that assumed seed shortages and tool scarcity. Civilians were encouraged to grow crops that stored well, potatoes, onions, carrots, rather than nutritionally fashionable produce. The deeper lesson here is logistical. Britain faced a U-boat blockade that threatened maritime supply chains. By decentralizing food production into millions of micro-farms, the state reduced dependence on vulnerable transport networks. This principle, distributed production as a hedge against systemic disruption, later influenced Cold War civil defense planning and modern resilience theory. In occupied Europe, hidden livestock and illicit slaughter sustained entire neighborhoods. Under German occupation, official ration allocations in much of Europe fell below subsistence level. In places like Poland, France, and the Netherlands, survival depended on what the occupation authorities could not fully see or control. Families hid chickens in cellars, pigs in false walls, and goats in abandoned buildings. These animals were fed on kitchen scraps, forage, and, stolen agricultural byproducts. Slaughtering was done quietly, often at night, and meat was distributed within trusted social networks. This wasn't merely black market behavior, it was a form of parallel provisioning. Occupation authorities could seize grain shipments or enforce quotas on registered farms, but they struggled to suppress dispersed informal food systems embedded in private homes. The social cost was high. Discovery meant severe punishment, but the payoff was nutritional survival. Post-war food security studies repeatedly return to this lesson. Centralized control is powerful, but it is, brittle. Informal networks, when socially cohesive, can outperform formal systems under coercive conditions. Civilian preservation skills turned seasonal harvests into year-round lifelines. Refrigeration was rare, electricity unreliable, and, well, transport was often disrupted. Civilians survived by mastering preservation methods that modern societies had largely abandoned by the 1930s. Canning, bottling, pickling, drying, salting, and smoking were not hobbies. They were, strategic practices. In Germany and Eastern Europe, communal canning centers allowed families to process large quantities of produce efficiently using shared equipment. In Japan, urban households dried vegetables and fish to reduce dependence on rice deliveries, which were increasingly diverted to the military. What really mattered was predictability. Preserved food reduced exposure to ration fluctuations, bombing damage, and, transport failures. It also allowed households to sort of smooth calorie intake across the year, which actually had measurable effects on health outcomes, especially among children. Modern disaster preparedness often, rediscovers these methods as novelties, but during the Second World War they were baseline competence, taught in schools and reinforced through public instruction. Urban foraging quietly supplemented official rations in ways that governments rarely acknowledged. In bombed cities, ruins, in fact, became resources. Civilians collected edible weeds, mushrooms, nuts, and even snails from parks, riverbanks, and abandoned lots. In London, Berlin, and Leningrad, guidebooks circulated, sometimes officially, sometimes informally, identifying safe wild foods. Authorities were, pretty ambivalent. Publicly, governments preferred to emphasize ration fairness and morale. But privately, they tolerated foraging because it actually reduced pressure on supply systems. The line was drawn at anything that threatened agricultural output or public order. This practice, it exposed a blind spot in modern urban planning. Cities are not nutritionally inert. Even heavily industrialized environments contain biological resources that can be mobilized in a crisis, provided populations retain ecological knowledge. World War II demonstrated how quickly such knowledge can return when necessity demands it. Food-sharing networks replaced money where markets collapsed. Inflation, currency manipulation, and occupation policies rendered cash unreliable across much of Europe and Asia. In response, civilians reverted to barter and reciprocal exchange. Urban families traded labor for food with rural relatives. Clothes, furniture, and tools were exchanged for grain or dairy. In some regions, especially in the Soviet Union and China, entire local economies operated on trust-based credit systems rather than formal currency. These systems were fragile but resilient. They depended on social memory, reputation, and repeated interaction rather than contracts. While inefficient by peacetime standards, they proved remarkably adaptable under stress. After the war, economists studying reconstruction noted that recovery often proceeded faster in areas where informal exchange networks had survived intact. Social capital, not just physical infrastructure, mattered. Governments quietly adjusted nutritional science to match scarcity. One of the least discussed survival strategies of World War II was intellectual. Governments redefined what adequate nutrition meant. British scientists recalculated minimum dietary requirements based on available foods, emphasizing caloric sufficiency and essential micronutrients rather than variety. This allowed rationing systems to be optimized for health rather than comfort. Despite shortages, Britain emerged from the war with improved average health metrics in some demographics. Similar recalibrations occurred in Canada, Sweden, and parts of the United States. Nutrition became a strategic discipline, informing everything from agricultural policy to factory canteens. This had lasting consequences. Post-war food policy, welfare programs, and even modern dietary guidelines trace their roots to wartime necessity-driven science. Why these civilian survival systems still matter today. World War II. Civilian food survival wasn't accidental, and it wasn't purely governmental. It was the product of ordinary people adapting intelligently to systemic failure, often faster than institutions could respond. These stories matter because they challenge comforting assumptions. They show that resilience is learned, that decentralization can save lives, and that knowledge, practical, local, often unglamorous, can be as decisive as any weapon system. For survivalists, historians, and anyone concerned with how societies endure prolonged stress, these lessons remain painfully relevant. If you value this kind of grounded, overlooked history, subscribe to The Survival Record. Share this video with others who care about serious analysis over surface-level storytelling. Understanding how civilians survived the last total war may be one of the most practical forms of preparedness we have.